Today, we're pitting two of the world's greatest economic and military powers against each other, China and the United States of America. These two modern titans regularly go toe-to-toe on trade deals, cultural influence, and intellectual property. But today, we're talking about soldiers. We've previously compared the US and Chinese military and the average American and Chinese citizen. But this video is somewhere in between. In a modern ground war between American and Chinese forces, which infantry soldier would come out on top? We're about to find out by looking into each army's combat history, tactics, capabilities, training, and equipment. If ever China and America go to war, the whole world is in trouble. We're talking about two of the largest and most well-equipped militaries on the planet. China, being one of the oldest civilizations in the world, has an incredibly illustrious military history. The country can be credited with pretty much inventing rocketry, as well as giving us Sun Tzu's The Art of War. Comparatively, the United States is one of the youngest civilizations on Earth. However, it makes up for this by having been in constant conflict since the early 20th century and has consistently been one of the world's highest military spenders. Let's discuss some of the two countries' recent conflicts and see what it tells us about each of the country's soldiers. First, the Chinese Army, officially known as the People's Liberation Army or PLA. Specifically, we're going to be discussing the PLA's Army Ground Force, China's 1.3 million personnel strong fighting force. In the last 70 years, China's ground forces have engaged in significantly fewer full-blown wars than the US military. A number of China's recent wars, such as the Tibetan Uprising in 1959 and the Battle of the Paracel Islands in 1974, have been against forces so comparatively small they can't really be used to illustrate what a China versus USA matchup might look like. Also, because the United States and China are two of the largest and most well-funded militaries in the world, their equipment and training has advanced considerably over the last several decades. Perhaps the best conflict to focus on is the one that most heavily involved both the US and China's ground forces, the Korean War, taking place from 1950 to 1953. This might give us better insight into the tactics of the two armies here. Modern Chinese infantry tactics have always been based around the fact that China has assumed numerical superiority. In the 1950s, the world population was only 2,556,053 people, and China ended that decade with a population of 551,960,000 people compared to the US's population of 150,697,361, almost a fifth the size of China's. The size of the US and China's armies today still reflects this disparity. The US today has 1,281,900 active personnel compared to China's 2.3 million. This disparity gets even worse when you take a look at the reserve personnel, comparing the United States' 811,000 to China's 8 million. How did this vast numerical superiority play into their on-the-ground tactics in the Korean War? To answer this question is the legendary human wave attack. And no, this does not literally mean sending unlimited waves of infantry toward the enemy in so-called human seas. That's a common misconception. In reality, the human wave is another name for the PLA's short attack technique, which involves repeatedly sending small, typically 5-man fire teams in covert missions toward weaknesses in enemy defenses. These forces will then launch a brutal surprise attack, sowing confusion and worsening the weakness that was already there. If enough of these short attacks are successfully executed, a more large-scale attack would likely destroy whatever's left. And given that the PLA had soldiers to spare, they could keep up these attacks almost indefinitely. This tactic proved extremely effective for Chinese infantrymen, who would use it again in the Sino-Vietnamese War 29 years later. Much like the tactics laid out originally in Sun Tzu's aforementioned classic, The Art of War, the PLA rarely uses its huge forces directly. They often opt instead for tactics of ambush and subterfuge. Ambush tactics handed them several key advantages during the battles of the Korean War. An interesting case is the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, where a mountainside ambush allowed 120,000 Chinese troops under the field command of General Song Shilun to completely encircle 30,000 UN troops. They kept these troops, comprised mostly of American soldiers, trapped for 17 days. However, this brings us to the US tactics employed during the Korean War, because in spite of being overwhelmingly outnumbered by the Chinese forces here, the 30,000 troops were able to break out of the Chinese stranglehold. In fact, they even dealt heavy casualties to their ambushers in the process. Why? Because in spite of being an overall smaller force, as mentioned in our previous video comparing the United States and Russia's soldiers, US troops have incredible tactical versatility. ground troops of U.S. infantrymen are able to work with a greater degree of independence from their superior officers. They can defer to field commanders with immediate situational knowledge, rather than having a rigid top-down chain of command on the battlefield at all times. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir was a horrific ordeal for the U.S. troops, with stories of people freezing to death and bodies being used as sandbags not being uncommon. But the U.S. troops' tactical retreat was truly miraculous. How did 30,000 troops avoid total extermination from a surprise attack that outnumbered them by 90,000 men? Well, in spite of being farther from home and suffering from outdated World War II equipment and shaky supply lines, the United States' troops were able to improvise and adapt to their situation on the ground. This pattern has held true in many subsequent U.S. conflicts, such as the Vietnam War and the conflicts in the Middle East. While looking at these historical tactics can be useful in gleaning an insight into how a modern ground war between the U.S. and China might play out, tactically, the Korean War happened 70 years ago. What equipment and training do these two forces bring to the table today, when the USA and China's military spending and modernization has never been higher? First, let's discuss the equipment of the modern People's Liberation Army soldier. In terms of small arms, the primary armaments of the PLA are the QBZ-95-1 and the QBZ-95B1. Introduced in the aftermath of the Gulf War in the early 1990s, the QBZ rifles were a direct response to Chinese observation of American military activity in Iraq. The QBZs are powerful, compact bullpup rifles with a 30-round magazine capacity. These weapons are strong, reliable, and accurate. It has a fire rate of 650 rounds a minute. An average PLA member's offensive loadout would consist of the QBZ-95-1, a bayonet for close-quarters combat, and 6 WY-91 hand grenades. It's also been speculated that the QBZ-95 might soon be replaced by a new rifle, referred to by some as the QBZ-19. This speculative new rifle, first fully spotted in 2019, would be likely an improvement on the range, accuracy, and fire rate of his predecessor, with an option for fully automatic fire. A full rollout of this weapon, however, is yet to be confirmed. The United States of America's primary armament is the M4a1 Carbine, a rifle designed for close-quarters combat and introduced around the same time as the Chinese QBZ-95. This rifle was largely intended to replace the M16. The M4a1 Carbine is slightly longer and more cumbersome than its Chinese equivalent, but with a significantly greater rate of fire at 700 to 900 rounds a minute, with an effective range of approximately 600 meters for an area target. It's pretty much on par with the QBZ-95. A critical shortcoming of the QBZ-95, however, is features native to bullpup rifles, namely that they can be far more difficult to shoot when in the prone position than a traditional rifle, such as the M4. Reloading a bullpup rifle is also not as intuitive as a traditional rifle, and seating a magazine placed near the buttstock can severely affect the shooter's meld with his weapon. This can lead to a QBZ-95 shooter taking longer to re-establish their sight picture over an M4 user. However, in a close-quarters combat situation, you can't underestimate the importance of the humble sidearm. For the forces of the PLA, this sidearm is the QSC-92 pistol, a 9mm pistol capable of holding 15 rounds per magazine. The American equivalent is the Beretta M9 pistol, a 9mm handgun that's been in service since the 1980s. This is another 15-round capacity pistol, relatively even with its Chinese counterpart. However, due to the U.S. infantry's dissatisfaction with the M9's performance during the Afghan wars, they're in the process of phasing in a replacement. This replacement is the Sig Sauer P320, also a 9mm handgun capable of holding 17 rounds per magazine, 2 more than the PLA competition. That being said, a soldier's performance in war is defined as much by their ability to take shots as it is to fire them. In this particular department, the Chinese forces are truly lacking. Despite China being one of the world's largest exporters of commercial body armor, the grand majority of the PLA infantry are not fitted with any form of specialized combat body armor. This is actually a major source of debate and controversy within the People's Liberation Army. Some commanders, such as Kui Shan-wei from the PLA's Joint Logistics Provisions, adopt the philosophy that soldiers wrapped up in too much protective armor will get soft and lose their fighting spirit. Others, such as Equipment Assistant Lui Honghui, have a more pragmatic approach, believing that giving soldiers body armor will hopefully increase the soldier's sense of security on the battlefield. The divide between the commanders and actual infantrymen is clear here, though sadly for those infantrymen, the commanders make the rules. The result? Little to no body armor for the PLA. The forces of the United States are the complete opposite in their approach to body armor. For U.S. troops, body armor has saved countless lives during the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. where sudden gunfire and the shrapnel of improvised explosive devices were amongst the biggest causes of death. As a result, the US military came to the conclusion that more body armor equals safer soldiers, and thus better soldiers. United States soldiers are also fitted with high-tech equipment, from night vision goggles attached to their helmets to enhance low-light combat to advanced radios. However, while this means that the average US soldier is generally far better equipped than the average soldier of the PLA, it creates its own major issue. Modern United States soldiers are often forced to carry up to 200 pounds of armor and equipment. Some military theorists have estimated that soldiers often have to carry up to 20 pounds of batteries alone just to power the juice-guzzling equipment they need on the job. While this armor and equipment might give soldiers a tactical edge, the edge is offset by the fact that PLA soldiers can move faster, stealthier, and retain energy without such a cumbersome loadout. However, advances in United States military technology are rising to combat the weight increase issue. The U.S. military has created the Squad Multi-Purpose Equipment Transport Program. This program is designed to test a series of small resupply vehicles that can act autonomously, following infantry soldiers to the front lines with equipment, supplies, and ammunition. When these systems are perfected, it'd be likely to give the U.S. forces a major advantage over their Chinese infantry counterparts. So far, we've discussed the soldiers of these two superpowers in terms of numbers, historical tactics, and equipment. The final crucial element in the comparison is the training that these two militaries give to their soldiers. How do the U.S. Army and the People's Liberation Army measure up here? United States basic training is among some of the most respected in the world, even across other world militaries such as the British, French, and Canadian Armed Forces. Much of the U.S. training regimen focuses on building their soldiers as people in terms of strength and endurance before training them as soldiers. The U.S. military also added an additional 8 weeks of infantry training to their regimen last year, extending the overall training period to 22 weeks to extremely positive results. Colonel Dave Voorhees, in an address at Fort Benning, shared data indicating the new training had improved their soldiers' skills in marksmanship, physical aptitude, and combat life-saving skills from day one of combat deployment. Sadly for them, the soldiers of the People's Liberation Army cannot say the same. One of the most frequent criticisms of the PLA is that while its forces are huge, they're also woefully untrained compared to most major militaries. International defense research analyst Timothy R. Heath described the PLA's training as being of debatable realism, and the Army's lack of real combat experience can be a serious handicap. Correspondent Kristen Huang has identified the PLA's lack of trained, experienced soldiers to be one of their largest barriers to becoming a truly formidable fighting force. In this case, the sheer volume of China's military works against its interest. The cost, the time, and the resources it would take to train them all to the level of U.S. troops would likely be staggering. This, more than anything else, proves that on an individual basis, a soldier of the People's Liberation Army can't match up to the training, experience, tactics, and equipment of your average U.S. infantry troop. Let's all just hope we never have to find out for sure. Who do you think is the superior soldier? Let us know in the comments. Hungry for some more military comparison? Why not check out American Soldier vs. Russian Soldier or Army Military Comparison? If you like to train your brain, why not join the Infographics Show Army? All you need to do is hit subscribe.